Chairman, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Great to be with you.
I wanted to dive in. I know we are tight on time. I know you had a hearing today that we had to deal with, but I wanted to dive right into my first question. Winston Churchill purportedly once said, "You can count on Americans to do the right thing after they have tried everything else." Yeah. It's an unfortunate quote. With respect to the regulation of digital assets that are, what are the regulators doing right? And what are they doing wrong right now?
It's mostly wrong. I mean, if you look at the approach to the Securities Exchange Commission, it's regulation by enforcement without any clear rules about a product that doesn't neatly fit into our current securities regime or commodities regime. You have a food fight between the SEC and the CFTC on who regulates what. And all the while, the rest of the world is innovating at a speed that should be the speed of America, and we're behind. You have clarity in Europe, you have clarity in Hong Kong, you have clarity in Singapore and Japan. When mainland Europe is out innovating us, we're doing something wrong. So it's mostly on the wrong side of the ledger. And Gary Gensler's approach is, I'm going to send a Wells notice rather than focus on innovation, consumer protection, or fostering something that's going to be an innate good for the world.
So I know you and other members of Congress have been working hard on legislation to address the regulation of digital assets. There's an old quote, and I think actually Senator Cruz used it earlier today. There's an old quote that, two things you don't want to see being made are sausages and laws. We're in a presidential election year. Do you believe digital asset legislation will pass both houses of Congress? And if so, how? How do we get this done?
Well, we'll see. First, we passed the FIT 21 Act out of committee, Congressman French Hill being the lead author of that bill, and the bill sponsor, Warren Davidson being so instrumental in the construct of it. And we passed that bill at the end of July last year. And in the fall, things got a little dicey in the House of Representatives, so it took a long time for us to get it to the House floor. We will have this bill on the House floor next week for a vote. The outcome of that vote will dictate whether or not, what kind of attention it'll get in the Senate and whether or not we can get something done. So the first step here is to get it, first step was getting out of committee. We did that in July with bipartisan votes. We're going to go to the House floor, and if we get a wide bipartisan vote, that's going to help us a lot in the Senate. Then who knows after the election what's going to happen in lame duck in November and December. But I'm just going to push as hard as I can. And I think the fact that you've got 20% of the American people who have engaged with digital assets is a real force, especially in election year. And crypto voters making their voices heard makes a huge difference on public policy in a presidential election year especially.
Do you think the leadership in the Senate Banking Committee is supportive, or do you think it's going to be difficult?
Well, let's see what the vote is.
Okay.
Let's see what the vote is out of the House. There are a lot of skeptics that we could have a bipartisan vote out of the House Financial Services Committee. We rarely have bipartisan votes out of the Financial Services Committee, but we did on FIT 21. We did on the stablecoin bill. And I think that shows that there's real appetite among policymakers left and right to get something done.
So while the legislation is working through the process, we're still talking about the ugly side of the law, and as a lawyer I can joke about this. Let's talk about regulation by enforcement and how does that jive with the Administrative Procedure Act, requirement that agencies are supposed to propose rules, there's supposed to be public comment, and then there's supposed to be an opportunity for even petitions for rulemaking. We've had a number of petitions for rulemaking. We worked on one a number of years ago. Coinbase has worked on one. None of them have gotten anywhere. Do you have objections to regulation enforcement? And if so, why? And what are those objections?
Well, look, you have enforcement actions around clear pieces of law, and that's appropriate, right? We don't want this to be a a lawless society by and large. So, yes, these agencies should have enforcement powers. What they've done at the Securities Exchange Commission is a willful choice to not promulgate rules that are specific to digital assets. And then they're enforcing those people that they can actively find. Meaning, if you walked into the agency and say, hi, we engage in the transactions for digital assets, we'd like to be regulated. Can we get right with you with a no-action letter for us doing this very specific thing to the technology of a blockchain, a distributed ledger, and then that little key there that we think has some value? Like, well, it's a security, it's a commodity, that's all we got. It's a bad meeting, they leave, and then a couple weeks later, they get a notice sent to them in the mail. It's as if they had knocked on the door, made the SEC aware, and therefore the SEC then goes and knocks on their door. It's the craziest set of circumstances. But if you're a fraudster, if you're a international thief, and you're using the same technology, they don't do a damn thing about it. Mm-hmm. It's the craziest thing. The consumer harm that has happened and the massive losses have been in unregulated spaces using digital assets, and they've not gone after those bad actors. But somebody who's an American business who has raised money through the securities regime from a regulated set of entities, and they show up at the SEC, they're the bad guys. It is the most absurd thing in the world. Thank you, for the one person, for clapping.
Well, you know, Chairman, we walk our clients in quite a few times. I always tell clients that we're not going to put their head into the mouth of the lion. We will walk in on a no-name basis, because the last thing I want to do is walk in on a disclosed basis and have exactly what you talked about happen. And then we've also been explaining to our clients oftentimes it's, you know, we're dealing with rules that are based on laws that were passed when people wore leather football helmets. And the laws are...
No, we have important laws that are still in place because you had telegrams and telephones. And so we have a whole set of securities law because people are using the telephone.
Yep.
It's crazy. Like we should force these agencies to innovate. And it's a role of Congress to go push that. And the way we're going to get clarity here is by Congress making the law. And we're going to have to force these agencies to do what is otherwise in their power. The CFTC, frankly, can do much of what we're going to legislate with FIT 21. And the SEC can do much of what we're going to legislate in FIT 21. They just are they've made a willful decision, the SEC has made a willful decision to not bring clarity here. And that is a quite political decision by Gary Gensler, unfortunately.
So, turning to Gary, Chairman Gensler, in 2018, then professor at MIT, Gary Gensler, told the New York Times he thought Ethereum was a security. While the SEC missed its chance to take action against the creators of Ethereum due to the passage of the applicable statute of limitations and the change from proof of work to proof of stake appears to possibly be the basis for the SEC's newest action against people involved in the Ethereum ecosystem. During his sworn testimony before your committee, you asked the chairman if he thought Ethereum was a security, and he declined to answer your question. Do you believe he lied to Congress?
Well, I'm going to let people make that decision for themselves, but I can pose the questions, and the public can make a judgment based off their response. But there's a clear distinction between Chairman Gensler and Professor Gensler here. I think he knows better, and I think he was speaking truthfully when he was a professor and obfuscating when he was chair of the Securities Exchange Commission. I think what he doesn't want is to provide any clarity of his thinking and approach. And I think that's the reason why he was trying to wiggle out of my question set. That's my theory.
But we tell clients oftentimes that the SEC is like a referee on the football field. And when you talk about giving clarity, aren't those hearings the opportunity to give some clarity? Even if he's not speaking for the entire agency. And I know that's been a topic a topic of discussion when he's testified
but
before your committee.
Well, the chair of the SEC has an outsized influence. They're the agenda setter. They get to hire the key staff of the agency. They have an outside influence here. But I mean, there's a massive amount of frustration because I think there is a very simple approach on this stuff. We don't need complex legislation to address these problems, but because of his willful acts, we're trying to put in safeguards so that no future chair can do what he has done to digital assets. Putting in those safeguards is very difficult to legislate effectively, but those guardrails will help with innovation, capital formation, and just general clarity so people can engage in the space.
So looking at that approach, do you think Ethereum's a security?
No, heavens no. And we've written legislation that at the core of it is a question of whether or not you're decentralized. And if you're decentralized, you're not in the SEC regime. You're in a commodities regime because commodities are not centralized. And so, so at the core of this, we have a distinction for a digital asset that provides great clarity.
So as we look at the legislation that you're working on, and we look at the legislation that created the SEC, I always like to go back and remind people the SEC's mission is to promote capital formation, to protect market integrity, and to protect the investing public. And sometimes I think those get flipped, and protecting the investing public is put above protecting market integrity and promoting capital formation. But if we use SAB 121 as an example, do you believe the SEC is fulfilling its responsibilities? And if it's not, what could it do better?
It fails on all three. This does not provide for market integrity. It is a massive, SAB 121 puts consumers front and center in a bankruptcy rather than bankruptcy remote and protected. So it strikes against consumer protection. And as far as innovation or capital formation, this administration's approach is that capital formation does not matter whatsoever. And they have had the foot on the back of innovators with every regulation they've put in place, every Wells notice that they have sent, or most of the Wells notices they've sent. And SAB 121 is against the consumer. And so you don't have normal custody services provided because of an accounting bulletin written by the staff of the SEC. It's so stupid and outrageous. We passed last week a repeal through the Congressional Review Act process by which Congress can step in for an agency and say, you can't do this. We had all Republicans and 21 Democrats vote to repeal that. It is a significant thing for a member of the House to vote against the president of their own party on significant rulemaking. But we had 21 Democrats sign on with us. That is a good sign and a hopeful sign that we can get action in the Senate and push back against this wrong-headed thing.
So we talked a bit about the Financial Innovation Technology for the 21st Century Act, FIT 21. We've talked about the digital asset market structure. We're seeing litigation against Coinbase, against Kraken, against Binance, for not being registered as securities exchanges. Does the legislation address that type of issue, or is that something that's going to have to be addressed separately?
Oh, no, we clearly address that. And so you look at two American companies, Kraken and Coinbase. They've raised capital through a regulated securities offering. You have public offerings included and a review of the business practices of Coinbase before going public. And all that was fine, according to the SEC. So we have a regulated means of exchange and proper regulation of those that are in essence, equivalents to broker-dealers. in the digital asset space. And we also have a like-kind thing for the commodities space, both specific to digital assets in the regime, in the securities regime and in the commodities regime.
I guess one of the issues you mentioned that...
I need to make that a more succinct explanation.
No.
Before I go to the House floor next week, sorry.
I mean, Coinbase went public, but it went public under the chairmanship of Jay Clayton. I guess the concern I have is I don't know if they would have been able to make it through the process under Chairman Gensler, looking at what happened with the Bitcoin ETPs that took 10 years to get through the process.
But they did get through the process. They did get through the process. And ETH should be next. It clearly should be next. There should be no questions about it. Same set of constraints on that. But it did make it through the process. What we don't want as Americans is to look at these regulatory bodies and think that they're grossly political and that they're arbitrary. Mm-hmm. That goes counter to the rule of law and our belief as Americans that we should comply with the law. When you have such political acts like we've seen under Gensler's reign at the SEC, that calls into question all of this. Mm-hmm. These regulatory bodies should move and be innovation permissive, but it shouldn't be these sharp left turns, right turns that we've been experiencing in the last couple of presidential cycles. It should be a much more consistent set of regulations and an approach that is evolutionary. And what we've seen here is a revolutionary shift to doing the most progressive stuff in the name of politics, not actually for capital formation, innovation, and the betterment of consumers and protecting consumers.
I was somewhat worried when the Bitcoin ETPs were up for approval. Having worked on one, I was concerned that the regulation or supervision by a market of significant size was going to be the issue that Chairman Gensler and the other two Democrat commissioners relied on to reject again. I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't happen and that the majority was willing to allow the ETPs to be approved based on the reliance on the futures markets. Do you think we're going to see the market of significant size issue pop up again in the Ethereum ETPs?
I'll let you get into the guts of that question. That is a I hope we're past that because of Bitcoin clearing.
Yep.
Because Bitcoin cleared the hurdle here. I hope that I hope we can get on with the normative process for approving these things. It should not take a decade. But think of the revolution here. You know, when the Federal Reserve's testifying before the Financial Services Committee, and one of my favorite Twitter followers had as the backdrop the picture of somebody with a handwritten white sign that says "Buy Bitcoin" before the chair of the Federal Reserve testifying before Financial Services. And I remember that moment. And for this thing handwritten on a white sign, to getting the largest asset managers in the world saying 2 years ago, this is an illegitimate product that's not worth anything, to actually going to the regulatory bodies and saying, we actually want to be the largest possessors of these things on behalf of our customers. The revolution here is jaw-dropping. And all the benefits are yet to come. We've had just the scratching the surface of the benefits of digital assets and Bitcoin in particular, what it will bring. And it's all small ball conversations now. It's what's going to come in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years that will not look anything like what we've experienced over the last dozen years.
Well, I'm going to end with that, Chairman. I hope everybody will join me in thanking the Chairman for all of his tireless efforts. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thanks. Thank you.